When we had the big press conference at the White House with Kennedy, Dr. Oz, and the president, the pushback that I saw immediate afterwards was citing this one report. It's one report. It's one report. But what you're saying is that this senior medical officer, Andrew Moschholder, he reviewed 8 other studies, and there was a much greater consensus that this was going on. Can you talk through, one, how you found those, what documents, and then where you started to see the string of, I guess, cover up is the best word to use, or using tactical language to push it down the road, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one thing that we should note is that one report was actually what they call a meta-analysis. So it looked at a bunch of different reports in the scientific literature, said, okay, which ones meet this rigorous criteria, and let's summarize the findings of them. And so that one Harvard report that Kennedy cited and that a bunch of people, as you mentioned, were being critical of, was actually a summary of a bunch of the scientific literature, which we can see from these internal FDA reports were accumulating over the last decade or so. And that very first report that sort of kicked off FDA reviewing the evidence, it should be noted, was published in the second most prestigious pediatric journal in the country. So this isn't some preprint that hasn't been peer reviewed. This is rigorous science published in a journal that the FDA couldn't ignore. So the FDA launches this internal review of the science, and their top reviewer of drug safety for over-the-counter drugs produces another meta-analysis and shows the science is credible. And he's very careful. He says the association between Tylenol use and apparent neurodevelopmental damage is consistent across these studies, but it's not yet causal. So we can't say for sure. The studies simply aren't uniform enough, and they're not designed to suss out whether it's the precise cause. But he says the association is consistent enough that we really need to start informing women about the risk. We just need them to make informed decisions. At the same time, we need to tell them that these other over-the-counter painkillers have their own risks, and that they shouldn't have high fevers and, not be taking anything to treat their high fever. So he's not calling for, a public relations campaign against Tylenol or anything like that. He's just saying we need to warn women about the potential for a risk. And instead, what happened is FDA did nothing. They released one statement in 2015 about a bunch of different over-the-counter painkillers, and they say, we're aware of some concerns related to ADHD, and they cite that first report in the second most prestigious pediatric journal in the country. As more and more studies accumulate, and as privately the FDA is reviewing these studies and finding them credible, FDA issues no further public communication. And so the documents that I reviewed, they're the internal FDA reports that were obtained via FOIA by this law firm that launched a class action lawsuit against Kenvue. And the reason I started reading them is because, I talked to a lead attorney for the plaintiffs, for the parents who feel that their children were affected by Tylenol use. And he was like, sort of citing certain studies. And I was like, are those studies public? Are those emails that you're mentioning public? And he said, well, we obtained them in discovery or via FOIA. And I said, I would like to read them. And he said, are you sure? It's like hundreds of documents. And I was like, yes. So they just literally sent me their whole docket. They didn't point me to, specific documents. And in fact, just for my own integrity as a journalist, I didn't want to work too closely with the firm. So I just read every single document that I could get my hands on. And these FDA reports clearly, stuck out.
Wow. For me, as I looked and I thought, one of the things that is just really cool about your reporting is that you do add in all of those counter arguments, right? It wasn't really clear how many doses of Tylenol were taken. It, the amount of how often they were taken, and I thought that was brilliant reporting there. It was really cool to see. But the other aspect, to reinforce what you're saying is, man, when you get access to something like a class action lawsuit, that's got to be like gold for you as an investigative journalist. What did you learn? Because some of the documents that you did post were incredibly redacted. How much of what you got access to was redacted? Do you think there's a lot more that needs to be unredacted? And hopefully, Kennedy will hear more about this, and as the hopefully growing storm grows from your reporting, that they'll come out and release some of these. What did you find in those documents?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your praise of me trying to be even-handed on the science. That's something that we discussed a lot internally here at the Caller. And I know that this is an important issue to so many families, and I want to make sure that the science here isn't ironclad, but it is concerning enough that FDA, scientists, rank and file scientists were saying internally that we should issue some sort of warning. And FDA higher-ups who, in many other instances of FDA scandals like the opioid crisis, did the public relations bidding of the pharmaceutical industry. That same pattern to me appears to have occurred here, where the concern about public relations and about a relationship to the pharmaceutical industry outweighed a concern about giving the public full information. And that definitely plays out in the documents. As you mentioned, there are a lot of redactions. One of the reports states that FDA's toxicology division did their own independent studies. So several of these epidemiology reports, they were sort of collating and summarizing other papers, other scientific papers. But it turns out the FDA did its own independent science. And toxicology reports are basically animal studies that look at the toxicity of a particular drug. And there are certain signals that you can look for in mice to indicate that something is dangerous. For instance, there are certain studies that show that mice and their litter, when exposed to acetaminophen, the mothers stop nursing the infants,
wow, which
could indicate, some sort of damage there. So what did the FDA find? What were their animal studies showing? We don't know, because for some reason, when the law firm submitted a FOIA to the FDA to find these results, the FDA entirely redacted them. And in my experience as an investigative reporter, obviously I can't say what's underneath those black bars, but in my experience as an investigative reporter, doing work on other issues like the origins of COVID and FOIAing NIH, it's usually an inconvenient fact, right? Or something someone's embarrassed of. And if the science truly indicates that there is no risk here, I think that's something that the FDA should inform the public of. But if there is a concern, then the public deserves to know that too.